Hello, everyone. I'm Traci Arieli, end of life doula and founder of Comforting Closure. Welcome to another episode. Today, I'm welcoming back Dan Ford. Dan is the owner of Alderson-Ford Funeral Homes and the president of the National Funeral Directors Association. In this conversation, we're going to focus on funeral planning and preparation, not as something reserved for the very end, but as something that affects families long before a death occurs. Most people avoid these conversations. They feel heavy. They feel uncomfortable. Unfortunately, when planning is delayed, families are often left making emotional and financial decisions in the middle of a crisis. Dan works with families at one of the most vulnerable moments in their lives. He sees what helps. He also sees what causes unnecessary stress and conflict. Today, we are talking about what funeral care really means, how planning ahead can make things easier for the people you love, and how funeral directors and end-of-life doulas can work together to better support families. So grab a warm drink, find a comfortable seat, and join us for the conversation. Dan, welcome, and thank you so
Hi.
much for being here again.
Thanks for having me back. I love it.
Now, so for those who have not watched our previous interview with you, which I highly recommend, it's about therapy dogs in funeral homes. Can you start and
Yes.
tell us about your journey to becoming a funeral director?
First and foremost, thanks once again for having me back. I'm thrilled to do this and get the word out, share some of my thoughts and opinions and what to do's as we go along. But I started out at a very young age, grew up in the profession, meaning that I was what we call an FDK, a funeral director kid. So my dad, at basically in 1970, went to work for a gentleman by the name of Mr. Alderson. And Mr. Alderson had multiple rooftops, meaning multiple funeral homes. And within 6 months, he made my father manager of his Naugatuck location, which is where I was raised. And I knew that I kind of emulated everything my father did, I did. And if we had resumes at this point, if we put them side by side, it would be almost a mirror image from his volunteer work to his education, et cetera. But 12 days after high school, I was off to mortuary school and um, went to the same school my dad did. And although it was in a different location at that point, but powered through tri-semesters and basically got through school, which was not one of my favorite things to do. And I wasn't the greatest student, but just the same, I was able to graduate and then went off to do my apprenticeship in a city called Danbury, which in Connecticut, it's the last city before you get to New York State, and did my apprenticeship and stayed there for a couple of years and then came back into the fold, eventually working for my dad and then eventually buying him out. A couple other pit stops along the way that I don't want to bore the listeners with, but I'm also proud to say that I'm a retired career firefighter. So
Mm.
that was kind of sandwiched in throughout that journey, but that's the quasi Reader's Digest version.
Yeah, I always love hearing when um, uh, a business is in the family and it's passed down in generations, and I hope that continues for you.
Well, if my sister happens to watch, I bought the funeral home for my dad. I didn't get it. So that's kind of a family joke how I got the business and what is she getting. But just the same, we have fun about that and sometimes at my expense, but yes.
That's great. Now, everyone's so afraid of planning their funeral. What do people misunderstood or what do people misunderstand about that?
Well, people, it's taboo to talk about. Nobody wants to convey it. I mean, I don't know how it is in your world as a doula, but it's just people hear that and they cringe. What do you do for a living? And you tell them, and and my father used to refer to it as vapor locking. They don't know what to say or do next. And I'm very fortunate where I'm a communicator. I feel like I don't have a problem. You could put me in any room with any group of people and we'd find common ground
Yeah.
and it would all be positive. I'm a glasses half full guy. we would essentially talk about things. And I absolutely love talking about our profession and what we do. I love people getting an education on what we do. I'll share with you that about an hour ago, fielded a phone call, and the answering service took the call because it's a weekend, and the answering service patched the call to me, and I said, "Hi, this is Dan. How can I help?" And she says, "Wow, you said, how can you help?" I said, "Yeah, how can I help?" And because I want to know, do you just have questions, or, what can I do to jump in and step into probably what is the worst part or worst component of your life?
Yeah.
And I was able, it turns out the woman knew who I was, and I know who she is, and just from being in smaller communities. And I walked her through the process, and we talked about options. And that way, she, at the time of her mother's passing, this will be a prearranged process where, yes, she waited till her mother's on hospice. However, they had a conversation. They talked about other experiences that they've had, good and bad, and they've talked about different things. And that's one of the most important parts of what I want to stress today in our conversation is that element of conversation.
Now, I talk about my parents a lot on this program, and I use them as examples, and I know how fortunate I am. They actually bought their plots and made their funeral arrangements years
Mhm.
ago, like decades ago, and had that conversation with me and my two older brothers to let us know what they did and where to find the paperwork and who to talk to. Um, because at least in the Chicagoland area, there isn't a lot of room anymore to have a plot. So they did it to make sure that they were right next to each other and
Mhm.
to make sure that everything was taken care of so that we could focus on being a family after they passed away. Um, I look at funeral planning as part of life planning, really, instead of after death planning. And and I personally believe that it really protects the person's quality of life. Um, do you
Well,
have a lot of people? Go ahead.
yeah, it's really important, and you've seen it a million times over when a death occurs, that people are bombarded with decision making. And someone in our profession at one point, and I believe it was a member of our national association, had gone through and calculated that there's over 100 different decisions that have to be made within the first 24 hours of someone's passing. um, you take different religious beliefs and aspects into account, and decision making. Sometimes the culture dictates what the funeral arrangements are going to be, but there's others, and I, very much like you, I use my own parents in the equation. Um, we do this day in and day out. And my mother, we lost my mom back in 2018. In fact, we lost my mother-in-law and my mother within 6 weeks of each other back in 2018. Not to mention our dog Hollister. I didn't name the dog, by the way. But the crazy part about all of that, my mother in law had a conversation with my wife and stressed what she wanted and what she didn't want. And what somebody doesn't want, I find, is just as important as what they want. Um, Fast forward to my mother hijacked and changed her plans 2 weeks before she passed. My mother used to watch some old TV shows, and there was a particular network that aired those in our part of the country. And so, one of the things that I'll never let go of are the memories that I was able to sit with my mother and watch those. And she had seen them a million times over, but she'd interrupt like her own viewing and say, I don't want this or I want that. And then it was her and I having a conversation about what I needed. And that's just as important. So I deal with people all the time that say, okay, dad said that he didn't want this and he didn't want that. And they, people don't often take into account what their family might need or what's in the best interest of their families. And I used the story, and I may have shared this the last time we spoke, but a restaurant owner, pub owner, who has an establishment in our community, their father died. And the father had indicated, I don't want anything, don't do anything, just cremate me. That's it. I don't want anything. So as much as I want to honor someone's wishes, I explained to that family, and this is in no way, shape, or form any kind of sales pitch, but I said to them, you need to understand that if you don't do something structured, even it's something as casual as a gathering that you announce to everybody, for the next 4 to 6 weeks while you're at work, people are going to stop you mid tracks and you're going to get interrupted for people expressing their condolences and paying their respects to you. So if you can manage that while you're at work, while you're at this busy restaurant pub, great, not a problem. I just want to forewarn you that if you don't do something, this is what's going to happen. They said, well, maybe we'll honor his wishes. We won't have any kind of big religious service, but let's just have 2 hours of calling hours. I said, you're going to accomplish everything that you need to by simply having the calling hours. Now, I'm a religious person, but it's not for me to tell them that they need to incorporate a religious aspect to that. So we had the 2 hours of visitation, and weeks later, both the husband and wife at separate occasions had shared with me how powerful that was because they were able to streamline everything and have everybody come and pay their respects instead of constantly being interrupted at work when they're trying to serve people or they're trying to pay bills or trying to do what have you. So, again, it's not for the funeral professional to get in and dictate, it's the funeral professional's purpose to guide and offer up suggestions. And those in our profession, in our association, have been great listeners and mindful of what people want. And again, as I stated, just as important, what they don't want.
Yeah. And I totally agree with you. That sense of closure, having some kind of gathering to get that closure, to remember a person, to talk about them. I think that
Yeah,
everyone, from the person who has passed away, um, they want to be remembered. Everyone wants to be remembered, and everyone wants to remember someone that they love and they care about. They want that relationship to go on. So I kind of feel like this kind of celebration or gathering is part of that new relationship with that person. How are you going to carry them forward? How are you going to be in relationship with them? Um, and some people, what's becoming very popular, have something before they pass away. I know I do a lot of celebrations of life pre the death
a
and
living funeral.
living funerals, right? And it is amazing because those people get to tell everyone how much they love them, and they're able to tell stories, and everyone's able to come and tell them what they mean to each person. So um, it is not about letting go or saying goodbye or burying a body. It is about that relationship with that person and continuing that relationship, I feel.
Absolutely. And the more that people can talk about it, um, is paramount to what we can do to assist as funeral professionals. The worst thing that could happen is when a family comes in to meet with me, and it's not just families at times, it's additional loved ones and friends, and I absolutely embrace and promote the benefit of bringing friends in. Recently, a lady that came in to make arrangements for her father. I said to her, I said, we made an appointment time, and I said, now, who's going to come with you? And she said, well, I just thought I'd come alone. I said, well, there's no shame if you have a support unit nearby. And she says, well, two of my friends offered to come, but I thought that was weird. I said, it's not weird. And she brought three friends. So it was great because we're able to have open and candid conversations. And again, it was a situation where nothing was defined. The only thing that was defined was cremation. And there's more to funeral arrangements than just the method of disposition, whether it's burial, cremation. There's some other options that are growing trends out there. But again, having the conversation and mapping that out so that, again, there's nothing left to the imagination. There's a couple different ways, and you and I are probably head down a couple rabbit holes today. But one of the biggest questions that I get all the time is, um, Dan, you talk about this pre-planning and communicating. Have you done that? And my wife and I talk on the regular as to what's going to happen and what isn't going to happen. And it's so very important. I've even gone as far as to put it in writing. So I have at the funeral home, we have folks that come in and pre plan or simply call or email and say, here's what I want. And we have a file at the funeral home. We have folks that take it a step further and very much like life insurance or any other kind of pre-planning tool, they pre-fund the funeral. So we have a file that, indicates that everything's been pre-funded, that sort of thing. So there's a file for me that spells out exactly. And on my way to, come into the office to talk with you today, I thought about that, about, okay, maybe it's time I update that. Maybe there's some things that may have been outdated. So it's no different than, doing a will, updating a will, buying insurance. We prepare for everything, just people are not comfortable about having the conversation. So another aspect that our association has done, there's basically an arm of our National Funeral Directors Association called the Funeral Service Foundation, and there's a consumer website that's been created called rememberingalife.com. So rememberingalife.com is a wonderful tool. There's a massive toolbox within that website that orchestrates how to have the conversation, how to prompt the conversation. Just a couple footnotes from that. I found that when you talk about somebody's funeral, so today everything's televised or on the internet as far as funerals, etc. That tends to be a great way to open up and say, what do you think of that? And you'll open up the floodgates without a doubt. And essentially, I've gotten some phenomenal response just from that alone. People seeing a funeral, whether it's somebody of note or just, they see XYZ happen in their community. And that opens up a great conversation. And it's a conversation we all need to have.
Yeah. I think I love the option. I know it was really spurred on by COVID, but I love the option of having it on the internet, having a live stream of the funeral, because in today's world, people are so spread out. And it should have happened long before 2019, long before COVID. People are so spread out that when a person, a loved one dies, it is difficult and expensive to just get on a plane, and you have to miss work. So having that option for people who can't join physically in the room is amazing and wonderful. Now,
Yeah, and just a side note on that. I mean, we offer that. A lot of our association members have offered that. In different regions of the country, it's taken off where it's almost every service is streamed, and there's other sections of the country where people are like, nah, I don't want to do that. And but I agree with you wholeheartedly that it's a great tool in the great resources that we have.
Part of my job, as you know, is talking to people and doing some of the pre-planning itself, including what do they want for the funeral. And I actually go with people to meet with funeral directors after a conversation, to help in that arena and to make sure that things are being planned uh, beforehand. Um, Sometimes people don't realize that funeral directors, having a funeral director and in your court before a person becomes really sick and before they die, it's part of your team, your after death care team. And
Right.
a funeral director will take care of the family post death. People don't realize it. It is like, you have your hospice team,
Mhm.
that this person is part of your team also. When do people usually, I know most people must come to you like after the death. What does it look
So
like before, if a person comes to you before the death compared to after the death?
So there's a sense of relief when someone does things in advance. So again, I had mentioned a couple different aspects. Simply forwarding information to a funeral professional versus sitting down and mapping things out. One of the things that most people are not aware of, and you've seen it a million times over in person, our profession is regulated, and they're regulated by the Federal Trade Commission. So what happens is in every funeral home, regardless if it's a member of our association or not, every funeral home is required by federal law to hand and make sure a family has what's called the general price list, and that's a menu of our services and costs. When selections of caskets and urns and vaults and things of that take place, there's also a requirement where the consumer, the family or loved ones, are able to see the least expensive to the most expensive product. So essentially a cross section of all the above. And that helps families make an informed decision. There's the aspect of having wonderful people like yourself in the mix to help guide them. Um, but nothing beats sitting with a member of our association, a licensed funeral professional, to help guide ahead of time. There's massive benefits as far as the different things that need to happen when you don't pre-plan versus when you do pre-plan. So I take whatever we can get, meaning if somebody just goes through the portal through our website and says, here's my pre-arrangements. I don't want to talk to anybody, but here it is. Keep this on file so that I could tell my kids that Dan Ford at Alderson-Ford Funeral Home or Buckmiller Ford Magachi Funeral Home has the info, and that's all they need to know. In which I've gotten those phone calls that um, Joe Smith passes away, and his son says, "Yeah, my dad claims that he said call you. You know what to do, and we've got all the arrangements done." And I simply had a brief conversation at the coffee shop with that individual. It wasn't anything more than that. Versus the full extreme where somebody's come in ahead of time, mapped out what they want, again, what they don't want, and then been able to see what those expenses, all inclusive would uh, cost. And then even if we've gone as far as to mapping out how they're going to cover those expenses so their family does not have to worry about being burdened with anything. So we see that quite a bit. In fact, it's almost half the time when someone calls to report that someone has passed away, it's almost half the time where they've either prearranged, if not pre-funded. So it's becoming more and more popular. Yes, people are comfortable about it. But then there's also the aspect where I went to a house the other night for someone that passed away. And here I am. I walk in and I know them, they know me. And the individual that had passed quicker than they had anticipated. He was on hospice comfort measures at the home, and they had an appointment for the next day at 1 o'clock to come in and prearrange and map everything out ahead of time. So they missed that opportunity, but they had it at least in mind that they had that conversation and were able to come in and say, okay, here's what we're thinking of. And they thought of everything. They had mapped out everything. They had looked at our online plan and said, okay, we knew we wanted to be cremated, but we need to have a viewing prior to the cremation. We need to have an open casket viewing, and there are very strong believers in a particular faith. So we're going to go to church, and that's also incorporated as well. So yes, they didn't meet the mark as far as coming in to pre-plan, if not pre-fund, but they were able to have the conversation and map out what the deceased wanted as well as what they needed.
Yeah. So I have 3 follow-up questions. That's a
Ah,
lot of follow-up
sure.
questions. 2 of them are
Yeah, it's
totally
all good.
curiosity driven. All of them are curiosity driven for me,
Yes,
but 2 are really like just came to my mind right now. One is
sure.
in your in your town or where you is it like a small town? Like everyone knows everyone? Is it I'm just
So
curious about that. Now I'll
yeah, so we have 3 funeral homes and the 3 different communities, and um, we blend over or overflow into several small communities. So one community that I live in currently is about 30,000 people, give or take. And then there's another community that I was raised in that's about 35,000. But that 35,000, chances are that my sister or I went to school with all of those people, and it was where my father was raised. Cousins owned the drugstore, that sort of thing. And then there's a couple smaller surrounding communities, about 10,000 people, where they know us. Either we've helped them through this journey before, or we've been in the same social circles. So, yeah,
Yeah,
so
that's
it
really
is
nice.
smaller.
I, I,
Yeah,
I asked that because like I live in San Jose, California, and it is, it's not a small community, right? It is a large city and, or medium sized city, I should say. So that sense of having a community, is not there. And, so it's a very different feel. Um, and yeah, I think in smaller communities, there's more of a sense of community death care that you guys are almost a family and you guys are taking care of each other. And I think it even becomes more important when you're in a larger city, and especially with people aging solo now and, living away from their families, that taking care of this stuff beforehand so that you can have that community, not only
yeah.
the funeral, but other parts of healthcare and death care. Um, so that's why I was really curious, and people don't, understand where that leads. And then that leads me to when is the ideal time for people to really start planning for post death care. So let's talk about that next.
So there's really no line in the sand as to when you should get things done by. We've seen people very young. I'll tell you a story in just a moment, but the what we find is when you start mapping things out, you've mapped out your retirement, you've mapped out, you have a will in place. There's again, all these things go hand in hand, but it's been such a, as I mentioned before, such a taboo topic that people will do everything right up until they have no problem talking about who their beneficiary is going to be, and that someday that they're embracing the fact that someday they will probably pass, and they have no problem talking about that, but they don't want to take that next step, and that's okay. But you're preparing and nesting, for everything, getting everything mapped out and squared away, except for one of the most turbulent moments of your loved one's life. And why wouldn't you want to take that step? So there, to answer your question, there is no particular timeline, but if you find yourself going through and mapping out and doing a will and things of that sort, it's important. It's important, just as important as all those other aspects, to talk about your preferences. And it doesn't mean that you have to go and sit down and map it out. As much as I believe it's important to meet with a funeral professional, it's if you're not ready to take that step, it's important to at least communicate to your loved ones what your wishes are. Again, for somebody to come in, family, friends, loved ones to come in and sit with me, and there has been no planning at all. They have no idea. They have no idea if they want any kind of viewing, cremation, if they're thinking about, okay, burial, where that would be. So we've looked at and gone through even some of our archives to say, okay, Mrs. Jones passed away, has zero pre planning done. Her husband said, well, not for nothing, but she made all the decisions for her mom's funeral. Can we look and see what she picked out for her mother? So there's a kind of a glimpse. But there again, she could just be going off of what her mother told her. So it's not a perfect scenario, but it's something that we've used as a crutch. But it's very difficult as a funeral professional to try and guide somebody when there's been zero discussion. And that makes it very hard and very difficult to try and orchestrate what would be the right thing for that family.
Yeah, I think that there are so many different components that go into it, but um, I I have seen where people have had things planned, and I've seen where nothing has been planned like you, and I can tell you the amount of stress on that family, it's overwhelming. It is, you know, do your family the favor and plan and let them know what you want because that will help them be together as a family and not stress and just be present as a family, which is what you want after a person's death. And what I've seen also, what I think, and I'm curious about your feelings on this, generations. So, like you have the boomers and you have the silent generation. And many or a lot of the silent generation is still religious, very religious. And so I see that it's very defined what they want. It's like they
It
know
is.
what they want and it's based in their beliefs, their religious beliefs. And then the boomers, a lot of the boomers also, but less and less so. And so you have the boomers are really like in my, 70s, 60s. They're like, it's less defined because of it's just less defined. It's more of, "Oh, don't I'm not important." Like, almost like they're kind of like they don't want it's not as important to them. Um, are you finding something similar?
So it's all over the place, and frankly, it is. Our association has done some studies and market research, and it's basically polling people to find out a couple different things. We did a study to um, talk about language. You know, what is if I said to you, what's your definition of a celebration of life? Okay. That term is used nonstop. And if you ask five people what that is, you're going to get five different answers without exaggeration. So, celebration of life, in one of the families that I met with, they're, um, again, you're probably going to laugh, but the individual that passed away and his wife were both in my father's high school class. So um, she kept talking about a celebration of life. So I finally said to her, I'll keep her name out of it, but I said, Aunt blank, what do you mean by a celebration of life? Just so that you and I are on the same page. And she said, well, the thing where you go to after the funeral. I said, like the luncheon? Well, yeah, the celebration of life. Okay. Never had the after funeral luncheon been referred to as a celebration of life. So it's along those lines that our profession is constantly researching and trying to figure out what's important, and terminology, make sure that it's all the same. So that's huge in itself. Um, Going into specifically what we were just talking about is the other research that, what do the different generations look for? What do they find value in? Cremation is on the rise throughout the country, and a lot of people associate that to cost. And I don't think it's about that at all. On occasion, yes, it is. However, I think it's based on people's comfort level with cremation versus years ago where people were not comfortable with it. There's a lot of convenient aspects with cremation, meaning you can have, um, if people are, like you alluded to before, people are all over the country, but you want to get everybody together. Cremation gives you that option where you can have a funeral 3, 4 weeks later. You don't have to have something within a certain period of time. Um, but our study is finding that some of the traditional values with that younger generation are wanted and needed. So the folks that we're going to be having funerals for over the next decade, age wise, are being planned by generations that want and need the viewing. They want to maybe not necessarily go into church, but have a religious service, or feel that there's value in a religious portion of a service. So some of those, where you would think that the youngest generation that we're dealing with either doesn't want to have the discussion or is saying, I don't care. They do care. And it's kind of coming full circle. And we see that, glimpses of that. We don't necessarily see a full on, full core press for that, but it's cognizant of the study, and mindful that, people still see value in that, and there's folks that say, no, I don't think I need that or want that. But there's people that do need it to process their grief.
Very interesting. I see some funerals and celebrations of life um, getting very, very creative and really reflecting that person,
Yeah,
really reflecting that
yeah.
person. And I think that's wonderful. I think that's
Can I
how it
talk
should
about my
be.
mom?
Please go ahead. And then we're going to talk. Then we're going to talk about
Yeah,
finances, which probably everyone is kind of
yeah,
curious about. But
yeah.
talk about your mom,
Yes,
please.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I want to talk about the financial aspect too. So when mom was sick, eh, full behind the curtain here, um, she had diabetic neuropathy and was prescribed opioids. And as most do, mom got hooked on those opioids. And I feel very comfortable and open talking about this, and because no one's immune. No one's immune from this. And so I said to my mother at one point, I said, I'd love nothing more. We get you to the right doctor. Let's wean you off these opioids. Let's see what's going on. And um, we got her off the opioids, and there were still some things that were like head scratchers. She wasn't feeling right, and she had discomfort and this, that, and the other thing. And come to find out, the opioids were masking the fact she was loaded full of cancer. And so I said, we had an open discussion, my father, myself, my sister, and mom, and said, what's your path? You tell us, you dictate to us what's going to happen. And she says, well, my mother was a very matter of fact person. And well, I'm going to fight it. I said, all right, game on, let's go. And so took her to chemo, and basically, she was only with us for another 6.5, 7 months, and succumbed to the cancer. And so throughout that time, I had my own ideas. And then my mother, as I mentioned previously, hijacked those ideas 2 weeks before she died, talked about didn't want to go in the ground, wanted to go in a mausoleum, and so on and so forth. So I'm all about personalization, as most in our profession are, especially our association, in which we get together yearly to share ideas, and we're in person yearly. But constantly sharing ideas, and we even have some training courses that talk about opening up and personalizing. So my mother was a huge fan of Snoopy, Peanuts comic strip. So her house was every square inch of her house had a Snoopy of some way, shape, or form, stuffed animals primarily. So when it came time for my mother's wake, I went to the house with my wife and kids, and we packaged up all of the Snoopies and brought them to the funeral home, and every square inch of the funeral home had Snoopies. So friends of mine that came to pay their respects, they were able to learn very quickly what my mother's likes and dislikes were. The music that we had piped in was basically all of her, it was her playlist from her that my kids created for her chemo. And basically, it was everything from Motown to hard rock like Kiss to, some tunes from the disco era. And that was all piped in. So the best was the looks on people's faces when they were waiting in line and the music would change over and people are like, what is going on? But it was a way for me to share and personalize mom's mindset and her beliefs and what she liked. So I know I went off on a tangent there, but I love telling that story because I think every funeral should be like that. We've done everything from decorate the hearse in a particular football team's colors to we've even had caskets for particular Major League Baseball fans, those types of things. So I'm all about it. I think it's important. I think it's imperative that you personalize that funeral itself, and nothing should be cookie cutter.
Yep. I 100% agree. Um, it should reflect the person, and people should see the person in that funeral, and if there's a celebration of life, in that celebration of life. So let's talk about funeral debt. There is a term, and I had never heard before becoming an end of life doula, the term funeral debt. Let's talk about that reality and
Sure.
what people can do and how you help people through that, because it is an expense.
Absolutely. So, one of the things that a majority of our members focus on is and it all depends on where you are located. So, for example, two of our funeral homes are in blue collar communities. Um, we are mindful and we focus exclusively on somebody's budget. So, in other words, how somebody lived their life is how their funeral should be reflected. And not to be hung up on my mother's funeral, but even her casket. Um, I could have, these are all friends of mine that would have just handed over whatever I asked them to as far as her casket. But we pair up caskets and urns and services based on how somebody lived their life. And we did that with my mom. Um, the mindset of the actual cost and we do studies on that too, just to see where it is across the country. The average cost for a funeral sits around the $8,000 mark. Okay. When you're talking about those $15,000 to $25,000 funerals, those are full traditional funerals that don't incorporate things like people have to buy burial space. In other words, they have to buy grave space in a particular cemetery, the opening and closing of that grave, luncheons afterwards, things like that, all compound, and that's where you can get to the 15 to $25,000 range. When you have sometimes people look at cremation as an option, and I shouldn't say sometimes, a lot of times, because it's becoming the majority and a majority of the country. So, in my particular neck of the woods, in our funeral homes, it's 63% of what we do. So, those funeral expenses, because they're not buying a casket, not buying a vault, and the grave opening and closing is significantly less for an urn than it is for a casket. that's where we get back down to that range that we had just mentioned. So, um, with 63% of what we do, the average funeral is significantly less. Um, you can still have the same services, whether you're cremated versus buried. And it's again, it goes back to the Federal Trade Commission guidelining our profession, in which when you come in, you not only get that general price list, but what would happen is the funeral professional would outline those expenses so that you see everything line item by line item. This way, there's nothing left to the imagination, and it's unbelievably transparent. Um, I don't know, as far as the particular study you're talking about, but just the same, you could see how, um, when you add in some of those third party things like an afterglow, and I've had people that I think they spent more money on flowers than they did the funeral itself, which I was like, wow, okay. Um, but it all depends on what you'd like to do. And the nice part about our profession is that there's regulation associated with it. So again, there's a level of transparency. So this way you're able to look over and see line item by line item everything from what's referred to as our basic service of funeral director and staff, which in plain English means the overhead expense of the particular funeral home that you're dealing with. You get to see what their overhead expenses, what it costs for them to be in business. And then if you wanted to have 2 hours of visitation, you get to see exactly what that cost is. The transfer from wherever the place of passing is, whether it's a hospice facility or a residence, those types of things. All of these expenses are outlined. Again, referring back to the price list that we talked about before, the casket, the vault, the urn price list, the consumer is able to see the least expensive versus the most expensive. So they again can make an informed decision. And by doing all of that ahead of time, you have even more of an informed decision because you're not under the stress of doing something immediately. When I sense that a family that hasn't pre-planned comes in, and I just did it with friends of mine that they were unsure what they wanted to do. I said, well, let's do two or three options. And they said, well, we know, we trust you. It's not about price. I said, well, it is to me. So let's look at two or three options and the price associated with each one. And then that way we can make an even more informed decision. And I said, I knew your wife, I knew your mother. She took care of everybody in the community. So let's have that mindset when we're looking at arrangements itself. Let's make sure that we're doing right by her and not just automatically saying, all right, well, this is what we have to do, or we belong to this group and we need to, majority of the people in this group did this type of funeral. This is what we have to do. Again, shying away from the cookie cutter and paring it down to specifics. And you'll see some funeral homes have packaging, which sometimes people feel more comfortable with the packaging. Yeah, if we pick the Serenity package and incorporates X, Y, and Z, um, the funeral professional, even though they're helping a family with that packaging process, they're still going to outline what each individual expense is. And that way you're able to make, as I mentioned, an informed decision.
What are the steps that people should take? My viewers, the listeners, what would you recommend if they are thinking about it at all? They're watching this because they're thinking about it. And they could be anywhere in their lives. I'm hoping that this is for people who aren't terminally ill, that aren't at the point. What are some of the steps that those people can take, those initial steps to start thinking about it, to start documenting and planning?
Right. So there's two parts to that. One is the communication part. At a very young age, I had a friend of mine. She was like a sister to me. Her name was Elaine, and she had leukemia. And I was fortunate enough to be going to school outside of Boston at the time, and she was at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. So it was typically a 12, 15-minute car ride to go see her. And I used to do that on a regular, and we got to a point where she knew she was terminal, and although she fought and was a warrior, um, she conveyed to me what her funeral arrangements were going to consist of. And she says, I know you're not licensed yet, but I know that you're elbow to elbow with your father. And here's what I want. And I can't have this conversation with my family. They're not prepared for that. But when it's time, I'm going to tell them that you know what's what, and you could tell my brother that you and I had the conversation. Um, so that would be the first part, is the communicating, communicating with family, with loved ones. And that was a situation where Elaine, like I said, was terminal, but she felt comfortable telling me what's what. So here we are laughing and joking one moment. And then, a drop of a hat, she turns around and says, okay, you need to know X, Y, and Z. So that communication is unbelievably powerful. Just communicating with somebody. There's another component to that. I talked about rememberingalife.com,
Mm-hmm.
and that website has some tools in there where you can have what they call the talk of a lifetime. And having the talk of a lifetime gives you the tools and gives you the verbiage to have those conversations should you feel that it's time to have that conversation. And you're going to find that people bristle up and not want to have that conversation. But there's an easy way to have that conversation, and that's just doing some research through rememberingalife.com. So, having the talk of a lifetime is, again, just as powerful, and you can again prep for those conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, I brought up community death care before. And yeah, part of me believes that just that what a person wants and how a person wants to die is responsibility of the entire community, not just the funeral director.
Right.
And what I mean by that is, doctors should be aware of a person's values because that's going to help when they make decisions about end of life choices. And I almost believe that part of this also, we need to be having these discussions in our communities, as an example, residential care communities. Um, we need to stop being afraid of having these conversations because either we're going to make it easier for our families or we're not. And part of making it easier for ourselves and the families is getting all this planned when we're well enough to really have those conversations and to get what we want. To really,
Right.
because either we're going to make those decisions or someone else is going to. So I kind of feel like how much better would our lives be if we were having these
100% agree.
discussions?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. And I've had communities where I've tried to go in and have seminars and things. In one particular community, basically it's an older, they have independent, assisted, and then convalescent care all under one campus. And I tried to go in and have a conversation, and it was like, nope, 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 nope. You're not coming in here. You're not doing that. And I said, okay, well, I talked with the marketing person, and I said, here's a copy of my literature that I hand out to everybody. Um, my name is mentioned all over the place personally, but our funeral home name is in a very nondescript, very, very low key section here. This is an education piece. We're trying to educate people and make sure that they understand what's going on. And we've looked at a lot of different angles. I mean, I've, when we built one of our new funeral homes, I took out space at, the fall festival in the community. And it's a country fair, if you look at it that way. And it was, I didn't have the suit and tie on, but I was there just to basically have people try and be comfortable with the fact that there's a new building being built and it's a funeral home. And if you'd like to come see it, this is what we're going to do. We're going to have an open house. And here's some literature if you want to just take these booklets home. And this, you go through all these questions. And that was probably a better part of 15, 20 years ago. And I still have people come in with those booklets and say, yeah, this is what mom wrote down shortly after you met her. And it just goes to show that people don't want to have the conversation. But anywhere you can get the education out, people are going to welcome that education. So that's why I do what I do to get the information out. And I hope that people will embrace that. I know not everybody's going to be comfortable doing it, but I just think I can't say it enough. You have to communicate.
So, the last part of our discussion, I want to talk about the relationship between funeral directors and end of life doulas.
Yes.
Um, Putting it bluntly, there's a tension there. There is a
Yeah,
tension there. So let's talk about that. And I'm curious about your perspective
absolutely.
because I have tried to have conversations with funeral directors in my area. They don't want that. They tell me your
So
perspective.
yeah, so my personal perspective and what I try and share with some of our funeral professionals is that no one is really the enemy here. Everybody looks for their own niche, and I think the aspect of having a death doula in the mix, and my wife has even talked about that's something that she might explore down the road. Um, and I'm okay with that because I think at any point in time, if there's an opportunity to get the word out, it's important to do so. But you have to get the right word out. And one of the challenges that our profession has seen is, for example, when somebody says, um, Mom talked about cremation, and then the individual that's helping automatically looks for the least expensive provider of cremation instead of addressing the fact that there needs to be some form of ceremony or some form of goodbye for that individual and discarding that element so that there is no grief process. Um, I've always embraced the aspect of other professionals and what they do. Just as a case in point, I don't think there's any way, shape, or form that I could be in the hospice environment. I'm too emotional of a person to do that. So I respect that area and would adhere to anything that they have as far as ideas and plans. Um, when it comes to a funeral, I think a licensed funeral professional should be the only one really discussing and talking about funerals. And there's some states that that's actually a state statute, state law, that the only person that could sit and discuss and plan funeral arrangements is a licensed funeral professional. That doesn't mean, however, that there can't be any kind of assistance and guidance along the way. Um, Another nightmare situation that I came across not too long ago, there was a particular hospital that the family said, to the social worker, geez, I don't know what we're going to do. Dad didn't plan for anything. And other than the fact he talked about he wanted to be cremated, um, we're going to have to figure out, I'm going to have to circle the wagons here, figure out how we're going to pay for all of this. And the social worker pulled a pre-printed piece of paper out of their pocket and provided three direct cremation providers um, based on cost. And
Hmm.
it had nothing to do with helping them through that grief journey. It was here's three people, and they are, um, I know they're cheap, and that was the terminology that was used. Well, as we started out talking about, our profession is based on working within somebody's budget and helping them and guiding them. And I talked about it, friends or not. I talked about the value of saying, here's what here's three different options. Let's curtail that to A, how mom lived her life, B, what you can afford, and overall, what your comfort level is. So the last thing I want to do is have it family have this massive financial burden or have to get a loan to pay for funeral expenses. I have a pit in my stomach. So if there's somebody in the wings that can help guide, such as a doula, why not? Um, I don't think that I think our profession has felt that people are overstepping at times,
Yes.
and on occasion they are. But on occasion, which is a rarity, it's not something that's a regular basis. Um, and our phones essentially. Well, you get to see my wife and I. The our phones listen to us, right? I mean,
Yes.
I don't think there's anybody out there that would disagree with me, but I was talking to my wife Danielle today about how you and I were going to catch up, and I gave her a little bit of your history, and she says, "Oh, that's Tracy's the same person you talked with before," and I said, "Yeah." Well, happened to scroll through social media while I had a couple minutes, and there was some reels um, from people saying, "Don't call the funeral home, don't do this, don't do that," and it was just bad advice.
Yeah.
um, and I don't think that we should shoehorn anybody into one particular category. I think very much like you and I have created a healthy relationship where we can communicate and to have open conversation. That's paramount. Just, I think communication. I know I keep saying that, um, but I would welcome any kind of death doula into our fold at any point in time, just so that they can see the values. We don't treat each other as the enemy, where we're level playing field, where there's no way that I could do your job. I truly couldn't. And I think you probably feel comfortable saying the same about me, but
I do, and I really feel like where end of life doulas and death doulas, where we really fit in, is we cover all aspects of that dying, death, grieving, and so yeah, we are part. We do. There is crossover. There is crossover with the funeral business. There is crossover with social workers, with grief work. There's with hospice. But we fill a gap. As an example, hospice isn't there 24/7. They're there, but we can be there a lot more. To me, every single part of, and I would never take the place of hospice. They are our partners, and that's how I feel about funeral directors. They are our partners, and I do not want to take care. There is no way that I'm going to be taking care of the body post death. I might help bathe, do a ritual bathing after, and make sure that the family gets the time that they need, and tell the funeral home, hey, give us a few hours. But it
exactly.
is the job of the funeral director of the funeral home to take care of that loved one post death, and the family also. And to say you don't need that is a disservice to the family, really.
Right.
S-
And that's what grinds my gears is when somebody's given a family pre-printed literature that says, here's three cremation providers that I know are cheap. And I have friends that are in that niche of our profession, and there's no hand holding, there is no support. They're wonderful people,
Yeah.
but it's not what the family needs.
Yeah.
And to look at cost and cost alone, um, it's just not the way to do anything. And I think it's imperative that we communicate our two professions, communicate and continue to do so. I've been open. I had one doula that was essentially she had something out there on her webpage, and I talked to her and we had a candid conversation. I said, "Listen, um, you need to understand. I appreciate 100% what I do or what you do, but you need to understand what I do. And then just the same, some of the statements on your webpage are inaccurate. And so let's talk about it. Let's have a conversation rationally where we can I'm not trying to take over your webpage. but let's talk about it, and so you can get a clear understanding as to what we do, and we're good. Um, I've only had one bad experience where somebody came in and took over and said, "No, I'll be the go between you and the family," and that's not what the job description is. You know,
The job
um,
description is walking alongside the family,
right,
not being,
right,
not taking over for the family.
right.
Um, but well, I know that we're at the top of the hour, and I really want to thank you for your time and for your
Absolutely.
openness.
Yeah.
And I love our discussions. I really appreciate them. Thank you.
Yeah, I was telling Danielle, I said we could talk all day long. I said, unfortunately, these guys are going to have to cut down our conversations, and you can see how passionate I am about this.
Yes, and it's great. You're a really good guy, and
Thank you.
I would honestly send anyone to you. I
Thank you.
really,
I appreciate
I
that.
feel a lot
Thank
of
you.
trust towards you. Thank you.
That means a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome. Now, before we wrap up, can you let people know how they can learn more about you and get in touch with you if they need to?
So, first and foremost, that rememberingalife.com, that is a huge, huge resource, massive toolbox to essentially get all the tools that you need as a consumer before you go into a funeral home. If you need to have an open conversation, I can be found at fordfh.com. So FORDFH, as in funeralhome.com. That will bring you to our funeral home's website. My contact information. If you have any questions at all, feel free to email me through that, through the contact us page. My personal email's on there as well. So feel free to reach out if you need some advice, or one of the big things, just going back to rememberingalife.com, if you need to find a funeral home, that's one of the first things on the homepage. You can find a NFDA member funeral home by simply just punching in your zip code. So thank you so much, Traci, for having me on.
You're welcome. Listeners, planning ahead is not about being morbid or pessimistic. It's an act of care. It is one of the ways we look after the people we love. When nothing is written down and no conversations have happened, families are often left guessing, arguing, or making rushed decisions in the middle of a crisis. When plans are made ahead of time, loved ones can focus on being present with each other. Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, please comment below or reach out to me directly. And if you've found this conversation to be helpful, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. This is Traci Arieli from Comforting Closure, wishing you peace and comfort in your journey. Until next time, take care.